Hello and welcome to State of the Economy, a show that connects you with key policymakers and thinkers. Today we have with us Mr. TCA Anant, who is India's chief statistician. He is the man who gives us inflation data, data on industrial production and what have you on a regular basis. He's Secretary, Statistics and Program Implementation in the government. Welcome to our show, Mr. Anant. How are you reviewing? I know that you're in the process of reviewing various statistical measures for a dynamic economy like India, whether it's inflation, industrial production, or household surveys on consumption expenditure. Now, what are the new things that you're doing to more accurately capture data which would assist better in policy making and policy assessment?
You know, in order to answer that question, Venu, let me give you a little bit of history. In 1999-2000, after the period of liberalization, the government concerned about the fact that the statistical system needed to be modernized, keeping in view the changing nature of the economy, set up a very high-level commission under Dr. Rangarajan.
The Statistical Commission.
National Statistical Commission. Now, based on the recommendations of that commission, there were a number of them, but the salient recommendation was the creation of the office which I currently occupy and the establishment of the National Statistical Commission as a permanent body. This was done in 2005 and 6 when the government this government came into power, and they established the office which I currently occupy. So, in a odd sense, even though the number of the recommendations and suggestions were made during the Rangarajan report, full-time regular work on a number of them started only after that.
The very existence of this new statistical commission was actually meant to look at how India collected data and review them, right?
That's correct. So, the Statistical Commission under the chairmanships of Professor Tendulkar initially and now under Professor Radhakrishna have been doing that. They have been reviewing a whole series of statistical efforts on a regular basis. So, they have looked at the statistical system of the states, they have looked at statistical systems of different ministries, and a number of reports and recommendations have been made over the last 4 to 5 years, number of which are in the process of being implemented. Now, in order to tell you in sort of short what we are doing, it's useful to look at all official statistics as comprising of two broad types of statistics.
Okay.
One is statistics which we directly collect through processes of surveys. Now, here,
like the National Sample Survey.
Like the National Sample Survey, which is the leading survey system, but then there are other surveys which are done by some other ministries, like the National Family Health Survey, which was done by the Health Ministry, and so on. Principally, our effort here has been to modernize the surveys, to improve the method of data collection, the timeliness, and also consider newer areas in which surveys can be constructed. In that, our effort has been to provide regular, timely data on key policy matters. So, for example, one of the initiatives which is currently underway is an exercise on a pilot basis by the National Sample Survey to examine the feasibility of generating quarterly estimates of employment in urban areas. This is right now on a pilot basis, which is being done in 3 states from last July, covering the states of Gujarat, Odisha and Himachal. We are the first, even at the moment, even 1 year of the pilot is not complete. We are reviewing the type of flow of data which is coming on. The survey was based on a specialized sample.
It's only urban.
It's only in urban areas, but it has a particular sample.
Why not rural? Because employment is one data which is very fuzzy in India, in the Indian context.
I think there were 2 or 3 considerations. One, rural is much larger than urban. Urban is a more compact problem. There is a much greater dynamism in urban employment. The expectation is that rural employment will be more stable and much more related to generic agrarian characteristics and the rural economy.
So since urban is more dynamic, it's better to capture urban.
That's correct. On a quarterly basis, urban would be better. So I think those were the factors. The survey itself is an innovative design because it's what is called a rotational panel. So households are tracked for a year on a continuous basis to see what changes in employment patterns are happening at the level of households. We have started getting the results. We've been for the first few quarters, but it's still too early to say, because at this point of time, we are still working out details of how the results work. Once we've got the pilot results, at least for a year complete, we'll share them with principal users. Then, based on the overall assessment, if people feel that this is useful, we may.
So will the principal users will be Finance Ministry, RBI,
RBI, Planning Commission, and if this is the big if, which is always a big if in survey-based data collection, if funding is forthcoming, and we will have to examine that very carefully, then we would be in a position to expand this all India. It's still in the process of assessment, so it's a little premature for me to say whether that will happen or not, but we are very hopeful that that will happen.
People have been wondering why there are so many inflation indices in India. Even the RBI Governor Subbarao has been saying that sometimes he's somewhat at sea as to which measure should he see while making monetary policy. And India is the only country, if I may say so, which actually looks at WPI, Wholesale Price Index, for the purpose of policy making. And now, I'm sure you're trying to correct it, but how are you evolving this new Consumer Price Index? And the latest one actually shows a double digit, and some people have commented that there's a 3% difference between what the latest measure shows as opposed to the average of all other indices.
I explained it by a number of factors. This is, by the way, not limited. The particular piece you're referring to has a lot of errors, and I'm not going to go into those, but principally on three grounds. One, the WPI is a mixture of both consumer goods and non-consumer goods. If you look at only the consumer goods part of WPI, particularly those which enter into the commodity basket of the various CPIs, then in fact, even by WPI standards, the inflation rate would have been higher.
Okay.
This is something which the Governor RBI in fact had noted in his speech. So that's point number one.
So he used some of the inputs that...
Yeah, but I'm saying for this you don't need our inputs. This is even possible from within existing WPI. If you look at its components, and you look at only those components which enter the final consumption basket, not investment goods and not other intermediates and raw materials, then inflation rate would be higher than what WPI is showing right now. This has been noted in the RBI statement by saying that the lower inflation rate due to WPI is because of low price inflation in manufactured goods. Okay, that's point one. The second point is there is a difference across different inflation measures based on the weighting rules which are used. Principally, if you notice the detailed data, which is available from both CPI as well as WPI, the major commodities in which high inflation is being seen are milk, certain vegetables and certain types of high protein items like meat and so on. Eggs, meat and so on. Now, the other characteristic of the new CPI is that for both urban and rural, these commodities have higher weight than what is visible in the two other CPIs in use, which is agricultural labor and industrial workers.
So it more truly reflects the consumption basket?
As it is closer in point in time. Remember, the one salient characteristic of consumption has been there has been a systematic move towards these high value items.
So the new index captures that.
So if you correct,
we'll take a small break here. Please don't go away. Keep watching Raj Sabha Television. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with India's Chief Statistician, Mr. TCA Anant. Mr. Anand, we were on the subject of inflation. Now, another question that comes to mind, a very commonsensical question, is India being such a vast and diversified, geographically diversified entity, do you think India can have one inflation rate? Different states have different per capita income levels, different wage levels. So how do you capture India's inflation rate into one in one figure?
No, what you're saying is correct, and that is why the new CPI gives you both all India and states. And there is a bigger challenge. Why do we calculate inflation? We do it for a variety of reasons, but one of them is as a guide to monetary policy.
Monetary policy, yeah.
Now, the question which you need to answer there, and this I'm now speaking as an economist, not a statistician.
I want you to respond as an economist.
Is how integrated is the Indian economy in terms of different markets? Now, there is...
here I want to just say something so that you can flesh out better. I have heard members of parliament telling me that in their constituencies, pre-Mandi, there is one inflation rate, and beyond the Mandi, where the middleman starts charging their margins, there's a different inflation rate.
See, that's possible. I don't know enough about the realities they're talking about, but our data shows that there is a substantial interstate variation in rates of inflation. There are states which...
Can you give us some example?
I don't remember the numbers right now, but it's there in our numbers. There are states which have had much higher levels of inflation. I think issues like proximity to major markets, transport infrastructure, etc., do play a role. So I don't think we are at the point where we can say that we have a single integrated market in the sense which some developed countries have.
Sure.
I think as we move towards a GST and removements of impediments to interstate trade in India, we will eventually reach there. But at the moment, we have an economy which is
fragmented,
partially fragmented. And certainly in consumption goods, and that too in agricultural consumption goods, the fragmentation in the market has been commented upon by other experts. Now, in such a circumstance, this is the way where my personal take in, and this is not a view I'm speaking on behalf of the government. I think we need to use monetary policy with a certain degree of caution in such an economy. And I think that is a position which consistently certain policymakers from the government have been saying, that monetary policy should not be used as the only instrument to combat inflation in such circumstances.
So therefore, selective control, credit control, etc.
That we may want to fine-tune our policy appropriately in terms of different regions, between different sectors.
Again, as an economist, do you believe that inflation rate in India, especially post the global crisis and this injection of liquidity by the West, has reached a higher plateau on a kind of permanent basis?
No, actually, I believe it's we have been at a potentially higher inflation level for much longer. If you look at the data, principally from CPI and from the final consumption components of WPI, then you will notice that inflation rates have been high, above 7% or thereabouts, from almost 2006 onwards. Okay, this is something which
even if you look at a combination of CPI and WPI.
No, I'm saying either look at the various CPIs or look at only the part of WPI which reflects final consumption goods.
Final consumption.
You can do that because the WPI list of commodities is available. You can only take up the component which enters final consumption or thereabouts. Then those commodities have seen on an average higher inflation rate. You see, in the middle...
So are you suggesting that we've probably been slightly understating our inflation rate from 2005 on?
Because of our focus on WPI. Because what happened is, in the middle, when the crisis happened, commodity, raw materials and investment good prices just collapsed. The demand simply disappeared. The market bottomed out for those. So those components of WPI saw negative rates of inflation. So the average of WPI weighting across both of those became very low. So you had a period when WPI rates were low, but CPI rates continued to be high. In fact, if you go back,
They were diverging and then they converged again.
if you go back and read the trade unions' statements at that time, they were saying that this mythology of low inflation is not true. There is high inflation and we need attention to it. There were statements being made, but because of our focus on WPI, which averages across both these, this picture was lost. So we have been seeing sustained inflation pressure, and this is not surprising to me. You see, the period in which you have been seeing sustained inflation pressure is also a period during which there has been substantial redistribution of income and injection of purchasing power in the income groups which will have higher propensities to consume.
Okay, you mean at the rural level?
At the rural and at the lower income levels. This was an explicit government policy. So I think the combination of that did see increased demand and therefore increased inflationary pressures. But it was all being accompanied by fairly rapid growth.
That is, I think, it's also reflected in wage growth as NSS data shows over a period of 3-4 years. Nearly 100%.
Yeah, it shows rural wages rising. There are a number of parameters which substantiate what I'm saying.
Okay. So now, do you think, with all the changes that you're trying to bring about, these variations will get leveled out and you'll have a single measure, or maybe indeed we can move to a comprehensive consumer price index like all other countries as a measure of inflation which can be used for monetary policy more effectively?
See, statistically, building a single measure is an easy task.
Yeah.
You give me a set of numbers, I'll add them up and give them a weighting rule. That's not the problem. The question which you have to ask is much more from the fundamentals of the economy. Are your markets sufficiently integrated for you to rely on the insight which comes from a single measure? That's a call which...
So are you saying that RBI should be cautious about using a single measure in a completely blind fashion?
That's correct. I think RBI, and I don't, it's not the, I believe RBI does not make its policy in a mechanical single measure converts into a single policy rule. They do a nuanced assessment based on a comparison of a whole set of information which comes before.
We'll come to a more detailed discussion on how the new thing that RBI is doing, but after a break. Please don't go away and keep watching Raj Sabha Television. Welcome back to State of the Economy. We are having a conversation with India's chief statistician, Mr. TCA Anant. Mr. Anant, we were having a discussion on the risks that exist in a fragmented market like India, the risk involved in looking at just one inflation measure. RBI, I'm told, in recent years have evolved other methods of surveying households on a quarterly basis to figure out inflation expectations and various other such indicators. Now, do you think these surveys are useful, number one, and do you think your organization can also assist with surveys like these, assist RBI or other policy making divisions?
You see, RBI has been doing these surveys and they have documented the basis on which they do them fairly comprehensively. I think as a general point, RBI clearly has a huge need of information to feed it in its decision making. We certainly do try to meet its need to the extent it's possible with us. Whatever is not being supplied by us, RBI uses its resources to do so. We have worked closely with RBI in most of these ventures. If you notice, even for these surveys, they draw upon technical expertise from our group agencies as well. I think it's very hard to, in this sort of thing, to make a single answer saying that one agency will do everything. there are specialized needs which RBI will continue to have, and I think it's perfectly all right as long as they do them technically correctly, which they do, and meet their specialized requirement. What we tend to do is whenever there is a long run systematic requirement at an all India level, and usually more than a single agency, then those do get converted into products taken up by us. I'll give you a classic example of that. The Debt and Investment Survey was originally an RBI survey, but because of its wide use in government in a variety of forms, at some point RBI transferred the conduct of that survey to my ministry, and the NSS has been now conducting it over the last 30 or 40 years. So these are issues which are examined based on the requirements and needs on a practical basis.
Now coming to the key survey that you do, which is the National Sample Survey, to capture consumption patterns in the Indian economy, consumption expenditure. Now there has been some this big puzzle that the consumption, all India consumption figure that you have from the national accounts exercise is way higher than what your sample survey captures as India's total consumption expenditure. I am told that it's your sample survey captures only about 50% of the consumption as shown by national accounts. Now, how do you deal with such a huge discrepancy?
Okay, let me just correct one statement. National Sample Survey does not do only one survey. National Sample Survey is actually an agency which does a whole range of
surveys,
into which consumption and employment surveys are an important element of that basket. Now, turning to this distinction between consumption expenditure as measured by National Sample Survey and by the national accounts, yes, this distinction difference has been there. There is actually an earlier report from our ministry which documented the difference in detail.
Is it because in India people understate consumption?
No, I think there are many elements to it. The understatement may be an issue, but I think there's a whole set of issues, and we are going to be coming out with a detailed report on that later in this year. But let me highlight 2 or 3 important elements to them. One is something called the contribution of financial intermediation and services. It's FISM, the allocation for what is done by financial institutions, which has grown enormously over the last 20 years. NSS sample surveys do not account for expenditure on this account. You know, whatever you spend on financial assets and so on and so forth, that part. The second thing is there has been a huge growth in the last 20-25 years of non-profit institutions which are part of the household sector. The NSS sample surveys does not capture that, but they are included in national accounts expenditure.
So
these particularly
they account for the discrepancy.
Now, these will account for a substantial discrepancy in durable goods. You know, you think about all the societies, NGOs, and activities, and we have a separate report from the National Account Division documenting the growth of this sector. We are still trying to figure out if we can make some estimate of what would be their share contribution to consumption. At the moment, we don't have a good handle on that. What we have done is there were a series of exercises.
So, in effect, you're trying to capture all the new activities that are happening.
That's right. And there was an exercise done in National Sample Survey to improve the non-sampling error on a portion of the consumption vector, which is on food articles and regular consumption items. That exercise has brought the difference down in that category between national accounts and NSS to about 25%, which is consistent with international practice. The other factors for the differences in changes in usage pattern, rise in the food processing industry and so on and so forth, all of which are difficult to pick up in NSS surveys completely. So, if you factor all these differences in, the differences between NSS and national accounts will reduce substantially. It is, however, true that you may still be underestimating. It is possible. I'm not in the higher expenditure categories. the expenditure picked up by NSS. Part of the reason is non-sampling error in the higher expenditure categories. In particular, getting people to participate in surveys, response error
It's very,
is more complicated there. By the way, this is not a problem unique to India. These types of non-sampling error problems are there in virtually every developed country of the world.
why is the industrial production data showing month to month variation?
There is a certain element of the teeth-like pattern which is because of the nature of the index we construct, which in technical terms is a last year's index, where we have a fixed base year with a fixed set of products, and in each product a fixed set of entities which are repeatedly approached to report production figures. If you have this type of an index, it will always be subject to higher volatility than more dynamic.
So there's a scientific reason for that.
That's right. And the simplest way to illustrate that is if I'm tracking production of a single product like automobiles, and I have say 5 companies. One of those companies is say Maruti. Now if you look back over the last year, you will notice there were episodes of labor unrest in Gurgaon which would have sent Maruti's production in particular months down to 0. Given its share in the total production, the production of automobiles on a finite set of entities would be extremely volatile. But if I look at market data, it may not be so volatile because what is lost in production of one entity will be made up by increased imports and sales from inventories and so on and so forth. This inherent volatility in production is exaggerated in a last year's index.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Anant. That is all we have in this edition of State of the Economy. We'll be back with another episode soon. Goodbye. Thank you.